best available control technology for large sources, those that emit over 25,000 tons per year of CO2 or CO2 equivalent.
Great. We have another.
Ryan Chilka, Bloomberg Television. Administrator Jackson, I was wondering if you could respond to some comments we got almost immediately after engagement finding came out from Exxon. Exxon called the decision the least effective and least transparent way of regulating carbon emissions. I was wondering if you could speak to that. And also, in general, give your reaction to U.S. industry and U.S. business that seems to be pretty concerned about this in terms of productivity.
Well, I don't think U.S. business speaks with one voice any more than environmentalists speak with one voice, and that's perfectly fine. I think I won't respond to any specific statement except to say there are lots of businesses who have been waiting for a clear signal as to whether or not the United States is on the road to clean energy and putting a price on carbon, or whether this is just one more headline, right, one more phase. And the reason for legislation is to take that question out of their minds as they try to recover, as they begin to rebuild. We want them to see clean energy as the profitable kind of energy. With respect to the endangerment finding, which started your question, I don't know how you call it untransparent. It was the result of a public comment process that began in April because we were able to finally get the endangerment finding out, which had been held by the previous administration. So we had public comment from April until 2 days ago. We received almost 400,000 comments. I commend to anyone who's interested in the science the review and response to all the science that is included as part of, required to be included as part of that finding. It is the U.S. government's statement and response to what we believe the state of the science is. And we've heard that echoed across the U.S. scientific community, which echoes much of the international community. And I will say one more time, the Clean Air Act allows us to do what it does best, make reasonable, cost-effective regulation. You've heard, I ask people to judge me by what we've regulated so far and see the results. A car rule that people say is a win-win. Emissions reporting that people believe will increase transparency because Americans can look at companies and see what they're doing. And a rule for stationary sources that talks about leaving off the table small business and mid-sized business so we can focus on the big emitters.
Next question. Over here.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Administrator Jackson. Tyler Suters with Clean Skies News back in Washington. In your mind, does the engagement finding give the U.S. delegation power to go beyond the emissions targets that have been mentioned in legislation when negotiating international deals?
Yeah, the engagement finding and the work here are separate. Certainly I am glad that we were able to complete the finding and make that statement just before. We barely got in, but just before. But that wasn't the impetus for our work. In fact, if you've been following our work at EPA, since President Obama became president, one of the first things, the very first thing he did is tell us look back at car standards, and as a result, we now have clean car rules that are coming out. And then in April, we finally put out a proposed endangerment finding. It had been sitting for years since the Supreme Court told us, mandated that we do it. So again, I'm not going to comment on the negotiations here. I will say that I believe what it makes clear is that the United States acknowledges the threat and that we are, as a government, under the Obama administration, doing everything we can to move forward on this issue because we acknowledge our responsibility and we acknowledge that we have to make up for lost time.
Next question over here.
Hello, Carol Turley, Plymouth Marine Laboratory, UK. Does your Endangerment Act take into account the endangerment of CO2 to our oceans and coastal seas, which is obviously part of the EPA's jurisdiction as well?
Now, we do clean water at the EPA, so we would be remiss if we didn't have a discussion about the oceans, acidification, and the impacts we're seeing, and I would be in trouble with NOAA and my dear friend Jay Luchenko if we didn't. A lot of the information there comes from work of her staff on those.
Thank you, Mr. Watson. I'm from Ethiopia. My name is Yusuf. I have two questions. One, do you think the endangerment finding will commit more emission reduction for the U.S. than already committed? Second is, do you think this endangerment finding will have the same staying power as the appeal, the draft appeal?
Is the draft bill?
The draft climate appeal.
Legislation. When you work for the EPA, you know that everything you do is subject to someone suing you. And sometimes what we do is because we were sued. And so one thing about a new law is that it erases some of the likelihood, not all of it, but the likelihood of lawsuits that happen on day one. And I think that that is one of the better advantages, although in my mind it's not the reason, the main reason for legislation is that it's economy-wide and that it's a very clear signal and that it allows for the give and take that happens in the legislative process so that people buy in and really buy in. That said, there will always be those who don't, and they may well.
Question up here.
Thank you, Madam Administrator. Jared Blum, Polyiso Insulation Manufacturers and the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. You told us about your efforts on stationary sources as well as mobile cafe standards, etc. 40% of the emissions come from the built environment, the design environment. Can you speak to us a little bit about what the agency and the government's going to do with respect to reducing those emissions?
I absolutely can, at the risk of stealing thunder from the cabinet members who will be here over the next several days. First, let me tell you what EPA does on the built environment. We spend time in our home performance with Energy Star working on new and retrofit programs to help build a market for weatherization and energy efficiency. We also, as part of the $80 billion in the Recovery Act for clean energy and green jobs, got a little bit of money, about $6 billion, to work on water and wastewater infrastructure. And there, 20% of the money is set aside for what we call green infrastructure. The acknowledgement that as water becomes affected in the climate cycle, because that's what climate really is, that water will become a really important place for investment, and it's important to do that in a way that's sustainable, that maximizes energy efficiency, but also maximizes the use of renewable and uses Mother Nature as best we can to do what Mother Nature does best in terms of runoff and dealing with runoff. In a broader picture, I'm sure you'll hear lots from lots of different parts of the government, whether it be the housing and urban development led by Sean Donovan, whether we talk about transportation and Rayla Hood, and of course at the Department of Energy, there is money in the Recovery Act there for low-income home energy retrofit. The idea being that oftentimes for those who either don't own their home or at least have money up front, even though we know energy efficiency pays for itself at home, we all know it, but between inertia and sometimes the lack of funds to put forward, I'm really proud of the Recovery Act that put money into those communities as well. And I'm sure I'm leaving out tons of things we're doing, but between Energy Star, appliance efficiency standards, and retrofits, and yesterday the President was at Brookings Institution and talked about a jobs program that's going to include a real emphasis on weatherization. With so many people in homes in the United States, we see a huge potential